Greetings and welcome to the first mini lecture looking more at modern theorists instead of traditional or ancient theorists. And yes, if somebody out there noticed, I did get my hair cut. So this is also the first mini lecture since I got my hair cut. The chapter in chapter 3 really focuses on three theorists, Machiavelli, Hobbes and Locke. I will mention a couple others and give away a couple of the exam questions that I'll put into the test bank. But I'm going to spend the most time on Machiavelli, one, because I think he's the one that people know the least, and because I actually think he is a transformational figure in political theory. So let me give you some overviews that are not from your notes. You can write notes to yourself if you want, or not. Most of the additional material wouldn't be things that I would test you on, but um, I might test you on a few things in these introductory comments, and I'll tell you specifically what it is I would want you to know. So, for me, when I think about Machiavelli, to me, Machiavelli really seeks to abolish religious, which remember had been at the focus of the medieval period, and emotional factors from the political process. So, he personifies a transformation from the medieval period to the modern era, and many political theorists, and I'm not one of them. I've taken quite a bit of theory, but it was not one of my formal fields of study for either my master's degree or for my doctorate. But I have an interest in it. Uh, a few things personify this break. First of all, he makes a revolt against traditional constraints imposed by the church. He believes that the church makes men humble and weakens their ability to lead. So it's okay to use religion to further your political ambitions, but don't actually really be religious because for Machiavelli, that weakens their ability to lead. Your book talks about traditional conservatives, and if I ask you a question from this introductory concept, it might be that notion of traditional conservatism that is discussed in chapter 3 of your book. Traditional conservatives are people like Edmund Burke, who many consider the father of modern conservatism. He believed that the government should uphold traditions and religious values with very, very limited and incremental change. And I've just told you what Machiavelli's view of the church is in terms of making men humble, weakening their ability to lead. He also believed that the Catholic Church was too weak to unify the Italian states, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Six key concepts, and I don't think you need to write any of these down because you'll hear all of these and you'll read most of these in the subsequent text. But first, I think Machiavelli is important because he is the first to really recognize the emergence, the importance, the potential of the nation state. And in fact, that's the reason why he wants to unify Italy. He sees the Italian city states as relics of the ancient world, and in this particular case, at the mercy of really strong nation states such as France, England, and Spain. And in fact, when we get to the realm of comparative politics and American government, most comparativists believe that France becomes the modern state, first modern state, and England is shortly behind them. So recognizing the importance and potential of the nation state, and that is what is prompting his notion to get the Italian states to unify. He takes a very modern philosophical view of citizenship and selfishness and self interest as a tool to build a stable and free nation state. He is also modern in looking at political considerations, namely power. We get back to that concept from the very first mini lecture that political considerations should be supreme, that religion, ethics, the things that the ancient Greeks were, for example, interested in should be subordinate to power and self-interest. He also separates personal morality, and I'll talk about that later on, that personal morality should be separated and distinguished from political practice. And I think most important, the last one, because we're going to see this to a lesser extent with Hobbes and even Locke to a certain extent. And certainly we see this with our founding fathers, most notably the Federalists, people like uh, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison. This assumption of selfishness and egoism as part of human nature. So, those are some overviews just to get you thinking in general terms. Now, following along in your notes, Machiavelli was born in Florence, although we don't know a whole lot about his early life. We do know that he was the son of a lawyer. The political environment in which he lived is very important. There were several city-states. Five of them were dominant, and the five dominant city-states were nearly equal in power. They were very hostile to one another. And none of them had the strength to unify all of the Italian people into one modern nation states. These city-states were also very corrupt. And as your notes points out, he rejects all theological foundations for government. I said that earlier. The Catholic Church is too weak to unify the Italian states and weakens leaders. Now, a few things that I didn't include, and I probably should have, but I didn't want your notes to be too long. But let me give you a little more background on Machiavelli's environment, and you do not need to know any of this, so you can just relax during the next minute or so. So, France, who I told you earlier, really becomes the first large dominant state and is strongly, right? It is a Catholic power. France invades Florence, and Florence's governors, led by a very powerful family called the Medicis, were deposed. When the Medicis were deposed, this is where we see the emergence of Machiavelli. He becomes a civil servant in charge of military operations. He even becomes a foreign envoy for the new government. The French get involved in a war with the Spanish. The French are defeated in that war. And one of the consequences of that is the Medicis are returned to power. And of course, Machiavelli, as a government official, is accused of treason. He's tortured, and he is imprisoned for a period of time. So when you take a look at this political stability in his political environment, one of the things that Machiavelli is really stressing in The Prince is the promotion of governmental stability and freedom from foreign control. And when he says foreign control, he's talking about both secular control by another nation, but he's also wants freedom from the church, which he believes has too strong an interest in the politics of numerous states, not just the Italian states, but obviously the French in this particular case. So there's your political background. Following along in your notes. You should know that his goal, his objective, was the unification of Italy through a strong prince. The purpose of the book is to teach a prince who's new to power how to rule. I would also add, and your book doesn't discuss this, I wouldn't test you on this, but I think he's also trying to appeal to Lorenzo Medici that, he is a person who can be trusted. And in this particular case, he's trying to get in the good graces of the Medici so he can be back as part of the government. Keep in mind that for Machiavelli, the objective is not the common good, which is what we were interested in the ancient world, but power, which he defines as personal greatness and the greatness of your nation state. He's Even though he's very irritated and upset by the power of countries like the French and the Spaniards and the English, he also does admit their greatness and admits that city states are relics of the past and probably nation states are the governmental system of the future, which of course it is. For Machiavelli, virtue equals greatness and prudence equals shrewdness. So, very intriguing. A major break for Machiavelli is not looking for an ideal, but notice in your notes the definition of prudence is assessing risks and accepting the lesser evil as good. Right? He's not saying, he's making a major break with the idealists here. The idealist had to remember that normative view of politics. What should be, how to transform what is into what should be. And in this particular case, Machiavelli is a critic of that. He is not concerned with concepts such as good or evil. He rejects Plato's forms that we were introduced to in chapter 2. But what Machiavelli is really interested in are the needs of living beings on earth. If you look at the textbook ties this notion of realism to international relations. If I were to ask you, is Machiavelli a realist or an idealist? Obviously, he is a political realist, just as he believes people are selfish and consumed with their own selfish interests. Machiavelli argues this on the national level, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a subsequent mini lecture. But when nations talk about being interested in the national interest, it is their national interest. Could be power, could be profits, could be prestige, right? Certainly, I think if you want to understand what motivates China, it's prestige as a national interest. I think it's true of Russia as well. Other countries are more interested in the projection of power, and for a lot of countries, some claim the United States, profits might be at the center of national interest. But the point is just as domestic politics should be divorced from ethical standards, in the arena of international relations, which we'll talk about in the last section of the course, political realists assume that the acquisition of national interests assumes what we called high politics earlier: military security, economic security. In essence, if you take a look at international relations, it's an anarchic political system. It's like the state of nature that Hobbes and Locke are going to go into, right? That nations compete and there isn't a world government to compel order and security. And therefore, Machiavelli and Hobbes in particular say that's why there is so much conflict between nations, because there is no international sovereign to compel good behavior. So Machiavelli is clearly in the realm of the realists. In this particular case, be honest with yourself, be honest with who people are. And if you have an accurate assessment of human nature, then you can make an accurate assessment of politics and power and all of those other things. Now, I personally believe that Machiavelli is too pessimistic about human nature. But if you make and agree with his assumptions, his political analysis is very, very powerful, and certainly it has had an influence on a lot of political leaders. I will get more into Machiavelli's human nature and what his political leader should look like in the next mini lecture. Take care. Have a great day.